Welcome to Class Time, your daily classroom for CSEC and CAPE students. You can watch this lesson in real time on Television Jamaica's YouTube channel or One Spot Media. We also are live on gojamaica.com. If you have questions on today's subject, you can send them to Television Jamaica's Facebook page at Television Jamaica or Instagram at television_Jamaica, or use the hashtag TVJClassTime. We want to see those questions. Today's lesson is CSEC Home Economics, and I am Lydia Dunn. Today, we'll be looking at pastry making. So let's get to the lesson. All right, so our objectives for today are, you can see you have your general objective. So at the end of the lesson, you should appreciate set standards, which are essential for food preparation service and acceptance. And then specifically now, we want you to define the terms related to pastry, identify types of pastry, explain the steps and precaution for each method, discuss the functions of ingredients used in each method, and analyze characteristics of a good pastry. Now, from our objectives, we're going to get our content outline. And your content outline is basically your subtopics. All right, so this is basically just a repetition. And just for note taking, you can write it like this in your notebooks, and then you're going to complete your KWL chart. Now, you know I cannot leave out the KWL chart. We have been doing our lessons, and remember, our KWL chart is what you already know in relation to the subject, or the topic rather, what you want to know, and at the end of the lesson, when you're going to assess yourself now, you're going to say what it is you have learned. And if for whatever reason in today's lesson, I didn't cover what you wanted to learn, or what you, please, I'm encouraging you, speak with your teachers, go back to school or even read, and then you'll answer your own questions. All right, so we're going to be starting with definition of some key terms. Oftentimes, persons just categorize pastry as anything sweet that you're going to eat, and that's not necessarily the case. So, as it relates to food and nutrition, and this is actually universally accepted, pastry is a dough. It is made of flour, fat, and water. And it can be used to create a variety of dishes, and these dishes can be sweet or savory. Savory meaning not sweet, just to make that clear. Now, there are different ways or techniques that we use when we're making pastry. One such technique is rubbed in. Some texts will tell you rubbed in, some will say rubbing in. So I choose to use rubbing in because that's what's familiar to me. But if you have rubbed in, you're okay. And now this is a technique where the flour is rubbed into the fat to make dishes such as short crust pastry. Now, this is a very popular technique. It's a very easy technique. When we're doing pastry making, this is one of the techniques that we start out first with our students. And once you master this technique, I promise you, the rest is history. And I want to also encourage you, before I continue, remember that food and nutrition is competency-based. It's a technical area. So we're not going to separate theory from practical. We need the theory to execute the practical. So because it's competency-based, it means that you need practice. So once you start from the bottom, you come all the way up to the top. You will get it. Now, another term or another technique that is used, we call the roll and fold. And this is where a laminated dough is made by rolling and folding butter or other fats into the dough to create hundreds of thin layers of flaky pastry. It's not only for flaky pastry, but I'm I'm singling out flaky pastry here because I'm going to discuss this a little bit more in the lesson. Now, if you can see some pictures here, this is where we do the roll and fold. So based on the number of folds that you do with the dough, that will determine the number of layers and flakes that you'll have with your dough. Now, I mentioned up top, roll and fold is a laminated dough. What is a laminated dough? It don't mean that you're going to put plastic over it and laminate the dough. No. Laminated dough means that there is just separation between the butter and the dough itself. So the butter is added in increments. You add it at different times during the rolling and folding process. And that way, this diagram here, I hope you can see some separation here with the fat and the dough itself. So that way now, that's when you're eating, if you know croissants, or if you know patties, that's where you get like these different layers and flakes in between, because that fat acts as a separation to make it rise nicely, puff, light, and flaky. All right. Bake blind. Baking blind don't mean you cover your eyes and bake. Baking blind means that you're just going to bake the pie shell without a filling. And oftentimes, bake blind is encouraged, especially if the filling doesn't need as long as a cooking time as the pie shell needs. So you kind of want to give it a little jump start. So with that, just I have it here. And there are things that you can put in the pie shell to ensure that it doesn't rise or puff, because once it puffs, then you may have to cut away some stuff, and that I'm talking about, which is the base of it. So persons will use weights, they will use dry peas and things like that to ensure that it remains flat and it have a very uniform appearance. Aerate. Aerate is just incorporating air into the product. How do you allow air to go in? There are different ways you can allow air to go in. You can sift your dry ingredients. You can use your fingers. When you're rubbing in the fat into the flour, you just raise it and just add air into it. Some persons actually add small amount of raising agent, but that's not for all of the pastry types. They may do that for short crust pastry. But all you need to do, aeration is just to create volume in your product. When you're doing pastry, volume, volume, volume. That is a key characteristic when you're making pastry, okay? All right. So now let's look at the types of pastry. We have short crust pastry, which is a very popular one. This one can be used for most baked products. We have our gizzardas, we have pies. Some people even use it for patties, even though it's not the preferred pastry type, but it's just because it's quite easy to make. It's less technical than the others, so they may just employ this method to make patties. We have the choux pastry. Now, this pastry is not a very popular pastry in the Caribbean. But if you go to some hotels and you may see some pastry items that look like swans, or they have something that we call eclairs. It may have one side dipped in chocolate. It's made by this method. But we're going to go further into this method. We're going to just kind of dissect it a little bit more when we go further into the presentation. And then we have our flaky right here, which is what I was alluding to earlier with the patties. And we have a nice pastry item that we call turnovers. Some person make tarts, different things. And you notice that there's a puff, looks like a pocket. I think the US, I believe, have this. We have it here, we import it. Hot Pockets. I don't know how popular it is now today, but Hot Pockets was a thing. Grab and go eat it, just warm it and eat it. It was made by this. It is made by this pastry, flaky pastry. Puff pastry. Puff pastry is a very rich pastry. So it's the richest pastry of them all because of the proportion of fat to flour. And if you can see right here, you see all these layers. It's just puffed and nice. And then we have this sweet. Some persons would call it sweet. But when I was at school, I was taught sweet. I researched, I hear the pronunciations as sweet. Now, sweet is beef fat. Beef fat is what they use instead of margarine, butter, lard, or shortening. Now, beef fat, and this particular type of fat is normally used for savory pastry. They may use this type of fat to actually employ other pastry methods. So beef sweet can be used to make flaky pastry if you're making a savory product. So if you're going to be making, say, patties, you want that beef flavor right throughout the product. Then persons may use beef sweet. But I know this fat is used it's predominantly used in Europe, in England, when they make like kidney pies and liver pies. And all the time when I tell my students about this, lad, miss, I'm not eating it. Trust me, you'd be very surprised. You wouldn't even know that you're eating kidney pie or liver pie. And I'm saying that because I was there. And based on how they flavor it, it's very delicious. And you'll see that right here. It also will give that nice, flaky, light crispness to the pastry dough. And you'll see it right here on top. Let me go back to that for a little bit. And you notice that the filling here, sir, it's a meat filling. It's a savory filling. We don't use sweet for sweet pastries. We don't use it for a fruit filling, and we don't use it for any sweet filling at all. It is strictly savory. Hot water crust. Now, this one is not very popular at all. And this one also is quite European. And this one is very similar to the sweet in terms of what they may use it to incorporate. If you notice right here, it's a meat pie, but it's a very dense and heavy meat pie. And it's not cultural to us, but it is a part of your text and you need to learn it. Now, let's dive into short crust pastry. Now, short crust pastry is a type of pastry often used for the base of tart, quiche, or pie. And quiche is a savory dish. Oftentimes, quiche, we use kalaloo, we can use ackee, we can even use a meat filling, or we can pair it with a meat filling and a vegetable filling, but this is very savory. It doesn't puff up, it crumbles, and it's short. If you want to think of short crust pastry, think of a cookie. Just like how a cookie crumbles, that's how short crust pastry would crumble. And right here we have some very cute little tarts that they will normally use when you're making short crust pastry. And remember I said earlier that some persons would use raisin agents in it. The raisin agent would be used in the self-raising flour. Now, the self-raising flour already has the raisin agent added to it. So you wouldn't need to add it again. If you don't have that and you're going to use a regular all-purpose flour or cake and pastry flour, that is when you would add some amount of raisin agent to it. All right. Let's look a little bit more at short crust pastry. So we're going to this one now, this is when I spoke about cutting the fat into the flour. And in cutting the fat into the flour, there are different ways that you can do it. And we're going to talk about that right after this break. So we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with more home economics.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.
Welcome back. This is CSEC Home Economics, and we're discussing pastry making. So let's continue. So we left off at short crust pastry. Now we're going to look at the technique in making short crust pastry. Now there are different utensils you can implement to actually make short crust pastry. And one such instrument is a pastry blender. Now the pastry blender will have like about 4 grooves on it, and it's very thin. And that is used to ensure that you cut the fat evenly into the flour. You want the fat to be distributed as evenly as possible when you're doing pastry making. And that is one way, just to ensure that the flour grabs the fat, so it has that separation, like I mentioned earlier, when it will create like the short crumb, or that easily crumbled when you are eating the product, or that flake. But flake is not for short crust pastry. We want like some nice crumbles. Some persons will use their fingertips. Now the fingertips, when you use your fingertips, you don't want to overwork the pastry. And remember, oh no, you wouldn't remember because I didn't mention it before. So you can use your fingertips, you can use 2 knives and cut the fat into the flour. More commonly now I'm seeing being used is complex technology. What's the name of that equipment again? It's not coming to me right now, but I'll remember shortly. A food processor. A food processor. A food processor would cut the time in half. The food processor would ensure that the ingredients remain the temperature in which you use that in the beginning. So I'm going to look at guidelines further down, but I'm going to mention it here, and then I'm going to repeat it or just reinforce it when that time comes. So there are certain conditions that you want your ingredients to be. All ingredients, when you're doing pastry making, they need to be cold. When it is cold, it allows for that nice aeration to happen. It allows for the nice rising to happen, and it allows for that fat to be distributed evenly. When it is melted, once the fat gets soft or it gets to room temperature, then you have blistering, which you don't want, or you have a clump, and you don't want that. You want separation. And what the separation does is that the fat would actually cut parts of the gluten. Now, what is gluten? Gluten is the protein that is present in the flour. Once water is added, gluten develops. And gluten gives that elasticity of the dough. But you don't want too much gluten being developed. Otherwise, if you have too much gluten being developed, you're going to be eating boiled dumpling. And nobody wants that texture when they're eating pastry. Pastry ought to be light. It ought to be airy. And it's just supposed to be crumble and melt in your mouth. Boiled dumpling don't do that. All right? So let's move on. Flaky pastry. Now, flaky pastry and rough puff pastry are quite similar. Some texts will use it interchangeably. Some may say that the rough puff is a little bit different based on how the fat is added, but you can be safe to say it's very similar. And it's okay if you put flaky and rough puff together. Now, this is an unleavened pastry. Unleavened means you do not add any raising agent because of the amount of fat that is present. And when you're going to bake it, that steam from the fat and the moisture that is added, which is the water, it will cause that raising itself. All right? Now, it is similar to puff pastry, but it is very different. There is one thing I should have mentioned for short crust pastry. The proportion of fat that you use for short crust pastry to flour. So I'm going to be giving you a ratio. You use half fat to 1 flour. So say, for example, you're going to be using 1 pound of flour. You're going to use half pound of fat. Half fat to 1 flour. So whatever the proportion is for flour that you're going to use, it is half of that for the fat. Now, the flaky pastry is not quite so. The proportion of fat to flour for flaky pastry is 1 flour to 3/4 fat. So you realize that we're going up now with the fat content. And that is why they're saying it's similar, but it's a little bit different. And it's how you actually incorporate the fat. So with flaky pastry, yes, you will incorporate the fat, similar, just like when you started with the short crust. Let me take you back to that. Because you do want it to, so you want it to resemble breadcrumbs. You want it to have that breadcrumbs quality right here when you're cutting the fat into the flour. You will start off with that with some of the fat when you're doing flaky pastry. But when you're going when we're starting now the roll and fold in order to laminate the dough, then the remainder of the fat is added in portions and rolled and folded in to the flour, the dough, I should say rather. So here we go. This is the technique. So it will start off with cold fat with the flour. We cut it into the flour, just like we said. Then we add cold water. Remember I said that all our ingredients need to be cold. And it needs to be cold so that the pastry holds its texture, has its texture and holds its structure. Because of the fat content, remember that once heat touches fat, it's going to melt. It's going to melt. So if it is already soft, you're just going to have one mushy, soft, doughy pastry, and that is, you don't want that. So if you start off with it being cold and then it melts, it comes into this light, crisp, delicious product, which is what you're aiming for. Once you have it now as this dough, once you cut the fat into the flour and you add enough water. You add water in increments. Please, this is very important. You add water in increments. Now, though this diagram has a measuring cup pouring in, you would add the water a tablespoon at a time. It is better to have less than more water. If you have too much water, that's it. You need to start over. If you have too little water, you can add more to it. Please always remember that. Once you have your dough now, let's move on. When you have your dough now, this is what I was talking about, how you'd add the fat. Some persons would add the fat as a sheet. And this is where some texts will show you that there is a difference between the rough puff and the flaky, based on how you add the fat. Now, the flaky, you can add the fat in dots. And that when you add the fat in dots or pieces like that, or cubes, for if you wish, should really be cubes. And when you add the fat in cubes, when you roll that dough over now and you are rolling it, that is what is going to help to create those nice light flakes. You know, when you're eating patty and the patty break off and you just see a flake drop off, this is responsible for that. This is responsible for that. Now, when you add it in the sheet with the rough puff, you will get the flakes, but you get more of air, like a puffiness to the product. Now, choux pastry. Now, this is not a very popular one. This is not a very popular pastry technique. However, it is important for CSEC students that you know as much techniques as possible. Whether you are going to employ it or not, you need to know it for theory. Now, this one includes eggs. And that is an important ingredient. And because that egg now is what going to add, it adds nutritive value to the product and it creates sheen when you're going to be making the product, which I'm going to show you some diagrams shortly. All right. So now this one now is a little bit different. Remember I said that the ingredients need to be cold. Now for choux pastry, because some heating element is used, now this one, the ingredients can be room temperature. And it's actually best if you have it at room temperature to prevent curdling when you're actually going to add the fat and everything. I'm going to show you shortly. Now, this is used for making like puffs, and this is light and airy. When you open this out, you're going to see like huge air pockets inside. Now, this type of pastry normally has a filling. It normally has a filling. That's why inside is so light and airy. And this, I'm going to go through the steps for choux. You start by heating milk and the fat. And when you heat the milk and the fat, you're not going to put it to boiling temperature. You just want the fat to melt and you kind of have it at a simmer. Some short, small bubbles coming up. And then the second step, you add the flour. And you're going to incorporate the flour as evenly and as quickly as possible for you to get a nice smooth paste over there at number 3. Now, once the paste has been formed, you're going to cool the mixture slightly, or you're going to cool it slightly because you don't want to scramble the egg. So you want to temper the egg, meaning that you want to bring the egg to the temperature of the mixture that you have there. And by doing that, you slightly cool it, you add the egg, and you beat it in as quickly as possible. And you add each egg one at a time. If you're going to put all the eggs in all at once, I promise you, it is going to flop. You're going to get scrambled egg, and the mixture is going to separate. You don't want that. Remember, it's all about technique, and it's all about execution and competency. Let's go now to number 5. Number 5 is when you start to incorporate the eggs one at a time. You should have a nice, smooth, glossy mixture or paste, for lack of a better word. Once you have that, some persons can spoon it and others may put it in a piping bag. And if you put it in the piping bag, you should have like shells like this. Some persons will dust it with icing sugar. Some persons may dust it with icing sugar just to kind of enhance the quality. And right here is your final product. You see, just puff and light. If you are to go into that product now, break open that product, it's going to be like clouds inside. And you just need to fill that cloud with some filling. And this tends to be very sweet. This is a sweet product. Now let's look at rough puff. Well, I spoke about rough puff earlier, so we're going to just kind of glance over that one. And puff pastry. Puff pastry, this is the richest type of all of the pastries. And it's the richest because it has the most fat. Now, equal portions of fat to flour is used. So if you use 1 pound flour, you're using 1 pound fat. Equal portions. This is the richest form, and that is the distinction between it and puff, rough puff or flaky. Remember I said that they were similar, but there are some differences between it. The differences is the amount of fat that is used. So you'd incorporate the fat just the same as you would with flaky or rough puff. It's just that the amount of fat that you would use. And then you'd laminate the dough. Now, there's one thing I also want to mention before. No, let me go on before I mention that. So let's look at the functions of the ingredients. Now, the water, remember I said that once water is added to the flour mixture, then the gluten develops. And you do need gluten because you need it as the structure of the pastry. That is what going to create the structure of the pastry. That is what is going to cause the starch to thicken. And the gelatinization, especially with choux pastry, the gelatinization is just the swelling of the starch granules. And when it bursts, it thickens and forms that nice paste, which is what you want. And it's also, I mentioned that before, and this is just a little chart just to remind you of the proportion of fat to flour that is used and the water. You realize that we have it in teaspoons and tablespoons, not in cups. Let's go on to flour now. The flour is the structure, and flour also adds nutritive value to the product. The flour is the structure, and it also adds nutritive value to the product because once the gluten is developed, that's protein. The fat, it shortens the gluten strands. So instead of having gluten strands long, you have a strand fat, a strand fat, a strand fat. And that is what is going to create the air pockets and make it light and fluffy and crumbly and flaky. That is what you want. All right? And it also improves the color. It gives it that nice golden brown color. It adds flavor depending on the type of fat that is used. Most persons prefer to add butter because, well, even though that's an expensive option, butter is the most flavorful fat out of all the options that you can use. And the options would include lard, shortening, pastry fat, margarine. So butter is the most flavorful one, and persons will tend to use butter, but then you know that you're going to spend a little bit more money if you're buying that product. Now let's look at the guidelines for making pastry. So while we just looked at the different pastry types, we looked at the ingredients, the functions of the ingredients. Now when you have all your ingredients before you, there are some guidelines that you need to follow in order to have a successful pastry dish. You need to ensure that your ingredients are cold. I mentioned that before. Now, not only are your ingredients to be cold, but your utensils are to be cold as well. And when your utensils are cold, it keeps the temperature of the fat. And the fat is really what you want to keep as solid for as long as possible. And it is encouraged that you weigh and measure all your ingredients before starting. So it's like the choux pastry and the flaky, all of these, you don't want it lying there at room temperature. Some persons' kitchens are hot. You don't want the fat to come to room temperature. You don't want any of the fat to be broken down before you say, oh, let me weigh this. No, have everything ready. So you're just adding. It's nice and smooth and sequential. Cut the fat into small cubes for ease of distribution and to prevent overhandling. Your palms, they are warm. Once you're using your hands to aerate by lifting it up or cutting the fat into the flour, you are bringing down the temperature of the fat. So that's why it's encouraged to eat. That's why most persons would use a food processor. That is what is current now. They would use a food processor, less time, and it keeps that fat nice and solid and cold. But you can use your hands. You just wouldn't use it as much. You try to limit the number of times you would be needing to aerate that mixture. And that's why we encourage you to cut it into small cubes. That way you handle the dough less. And though number 4 may seem like a repetition, it's not really a repetition. Some persons with overhandling, this one is with cutting the fat now. This now, the fat has been incorporated and you have laminated your dough. You don't want to be rolling. No. You just need the fat to be incorporated into the dough. You laminate it, and at the end of the rolls and the folds, you should have a nice, perfect rectangle, and then you're going to rest it. Relax it. I'm going to skip this one for a little bit, but you're going to relax the dough. Relaxing the dough would encourage the gluten to just come down a little bit. So if the gluten if you overhandle the dough and you have a lot of formation of the gluten within the dough, relax in between rolls. When you relax in between rolls, you allow the gluten to just kind of chill. So you don't get that tough pastry, which is what you don't want. And in chilling in between, you also use that as a method to maintain the temperature of the fat. I hope you realize how many times I'm repeating the fat needs to be cold. When it is cold and solid, that is when you're almost guaranteed to have a really good product. You add enough liquid to form a dough. Do not add the liquid all at once. You add it in increments as is needed. Sometimes when you add liquid or the liquid that comes with the recipe, you may not even need to use all of it if you have reached the desired texture of the dough. So you add it in increments, a tablespoon or a teaspoon at a time. Now let's look at the characteristics that you want for a good pastry, because it don't make no sense you do pastry and it's not a good one. Your aim is to have a good pastry. So the pastry should be light and golden brown in color. And most times if you go, so patty, I'm not going to use patty because we add coloring to patty to get that golden brown color. So I'm not going to use patty, but I'm going to use things such as tarts, sometimes turnovers. It should be light and golden brown. Now, I know Jamaicans who don't like to see things white because we say, no, man, it not cook long enough. Not for pastry. Please do not overcook it. Do not leave it in because I say, make it catch some color. No, it's going to be burnt. Remember that pastry have a high fat content in it. So the longer you keep it in there, the butter may be burnt and the color may reach the desired color that you want, but the bottom is sure to be burnt. So you want it to be light and crumbly or flaky in your mouth. It should not be heavy. You're not making boiled dumpling. It should not be doughy or soggy. If that happens, then that means that you have added way too much liquid and you have made the product dense, or the fat was room temperature and you overhandled and overworked the dough, which caused it to be heavy and dense. It should be flaky. You cannot make flaky pastry and have no flakes. That's not flaky pastry. All right? So your aim is for it to be flaky and light, if that is a type of pastry that you're making. It should be tender. When you take up gizzarda, I know I don't want to put anybody on the spot, so forgive me if I put you on the spot. But I have had some gizzardas that I have to use a knife to cut it. That really ought not to be the case. Gizzarda, when you take it up, if you're using short crust pastry, which is preferred, it should just break easy. A nice snap, and it should crumble in your hand, which is the crust I'm talking about. All right, so it should be tender. Tender. Let me go back. Oops. Let me go back to my presentation. Sorry about that. All right, so it should also have acceptable flavor. If you are making gizzarda, it should have a nice coconut texture. Now, some persons actually would put some variations in their pastry. And that is one thing I love about baking and cooking. You can make it your own. You just have the foundation, you have the knowledge, but then you make it your own. All right? So the acceptable flavor, the pastry should not taste like, why does it taste like patty and you're eating gizzarda? So you need to be mindful of what it is you are making, and it should have that distinct acceptable flavor. And there's one more thing I want to mention. You need to ensure that the fat is of good quality. It is not stale. So if you, for any reason, think that the fat is stale, please don't use it. It is going to impact the quality of your product. All right, so let us review, let us recap to ensure that we cement everything that we have learned. So, the 6 guidelines to follow when making pastry making, that was one of the things I just spoke about. Ingredients should be cold. You don't even have to list 6, but I mentioned 6 before, so the ingredients should be cold. The ingredients should be cold. You should measure and weigh all your ingredients before starting. You cut the fat into the flour, or you cut into small cubes to limit overhandling. Do not overhandle or stretch your dough. You add enough liquid to form a dough, and you relax the dough in between rolls. Why should the pastry be chilled in the refrigerator before cooking? That is to maintain the structure. You want the fat to be as cold as possible before adding it to the oven for baking, before you get the final product. How can we introduce air into pastry? 3 simple ways we mentioned before. Remember I said you can aerate it by putting your fingers, but just using your fingers to cut the fat and lifting it up and down. You can do that. Or you can sift the flour, and some persons may add a little tip of raising agent to the short crust. Now you're going to complete your KWL chart. Remember, you assess yourself at the end of every lesson. What have you learned? And if I didn't cover it today, please ensure that you take it up with your teachers. So students, if you have any questions on what we've done today, send them to our various platforms and we'll answer them for you. Until next time, I'm Lydia Dunn. Up next, CSEC Agricultural Science.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.
That's all for today's lesson.
All right, start from top again. Start from top again, please. Full up, top again. All right, so remember, we're practicing like it's real. So you're
Yes.
going into the lesson.
Good.
So after you read that final
Okay.
part, so I'm Janet.
Yes.
Then you're turning to look at this camera.
Okay. Agricultural science, and our topic will concentrate on animal nutrition and feeding. I'm Janet White Taylor. And so, that's all for today's lesson. If you have any questions,
It's here. Interactive classes for all ages on the School Time channel on onespotmedia.com. With a combination of live Zoom classes and recorded class time, Schools Not Out lessons, and numerous educational content, we've created a comprehensive 24-hour channel dedicated exclusively to educating our nation's youth. Early childhood through to primary, secondary, and tertiary, it's one stop on one spot for education 24 hours. Brought to you by the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information in association with Television Jamaica Limited.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.
Welcome back to Class Time, your daily classroom for CSEC and CAPE subjects. Today, we'll be discussing CSEC Agricultural Science, and our topic will concentrate on animal nutrition and feeding. I'm Janet Y. Taylor. And so we're going to go straight into our lesson, students. Remember to keep safe and stay focused. And so the objectives we want to achieve this morning, I want you at the end of this lesson to be able to name and state the roles of the constituents of animal feeds and feed ration. 2, state the use of materials from food processing in animal feedstuffs. 3, describe the essential constituents of a balanced ration, and choose appropriate rations for different stages of growth in poultry. And finally, calculate the feed conversion ratio and explain its importance. We also want to take a look also how animal nutrition, we're going to tie that up as well in your broiler SBA. So by definition, students, nutrition is a process by which animals eat and use food. When animals have proper nutrition, they are able to increase feed efficiency and also increase rate of gain. Nutrients, when we look at a nutrient, it is a substance that is necessary for an organism to live and grow. Nutrients make it possible for animals to carry out life processes. And nutrients are provided to animals through feedstuff. That includes feed and water. Now, where animals get their nutrients from? Animals are going to get their nutrients from plants, plant products, and also from animal products. From plant products, they're going to get it from grasses, forage crops and legumes, from plant products such as soya beans, oat bran, rice husk, just to name a few, and from animal products, bone meal, milk, and also fish meal. Now, animal needs 6 essential nutrients in order to grow and to develop. And these are water, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, minerals, and vitamins. Let us take a close look at water, because water is very important for animals. It is necessary for the animals to live. Water makes up 75% of the weight of an animal's body. And students, animals can live longer without food than water. Water is important because it provides animals for them to be able to carry out their biochemical processes and also to regulate their body functions. Let's take a look at carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, on the other hand, are energy-producing foods and should make up 75% of an animal's diet. Animals need energy for metabolic activity, physical work, and also for the production of meat, milk, and eggs. Now we are now going to look at types and sources of carbohydrates. And we have 3 types. We have the monosaccharides, for example, simple sugars such as glucose, disaccharides, for example, maltose, and polysaccharides such as starch and cellulose. And from plant sources, we are getting carbohydrates from pasture grasses, plant products such as root crops, fruits, seeds, and also grains. Now, students, energy is very important in an animal's diet. If energy is not there, the animals are going to show signs of deficiency because energy is very important for the animals to grow and to do well. So if energy is not there in their diet, these animals are going to become malnourished. And if they are malnourished, especially if animals are grazing, these animals will not be able to do well if they cannot get enough energy from the pasture grass that they're eating. And this may happen too if the grass that they're getting is inadequate, or if they're doing what we call overgrazing. They're eating that grass way down too low. If during the time of grazing we are going through a period of drought, then we are going to have what we call poor quality food, or what we call grasses as well. And sometimes when they take in the forage, it may contain an excess of water, limiting the energy intake. And so the animal is going to suffer from malnutrition. And so, these are some symptoms, students, that we'll be able to see if the animal is suffering from malnutrition. And so we have to remember, that 75% of their diet should really be energy. Good? Because animals need energy in order for them to grow and to carry out their daily activities. Right? So this is very important for you to understand. Good? So, if the energy is not there, it is going to retard the growth in the young animals. Good? It's going to shorten the lactation in milking animals and also have a decline in milk production. In mature animals, if there's a deficiency in energy, there's going to be a marked loss of body weight, especially during late pregnancy and early lactation. Prolonged periods of oestrus, lasting several months, which have marked effect on the reproductive performance of a breeding herd. And calves and lambs may be born weak and also undersized. Let's move on now to look at proteins. Proteins are organic compounds made up of amino acids. Animal needs proteins for building new cells and tissues, including muscles, producing milk, eggs, wool, hair, and feathers. They also need protein for body maintenance, that is the repair and replacement of tissues, and also for producing enzymes and hormones. Sources of proteins from the plants, we have pasture legumes, cowpeas, and soya beans. And from animal products, fish meal, bone meal, and also blood meal. These are some sources of protein for our farm animals. Like energy, students, protein deficiency could also be present in animals if they are malnourished. And even though it may not be what we call as advanced as energy deficiency, there still be some amount of deficiency in animals if they're lacking in protein, because protein and energy is very important in the diets of our animals, and for protein especially for our younger animals. So if young animals are not getting enough protein, we are going to have what we call reduced appetite in those young animals. They are not going to want to eat, lowered feed intake, lack of muscle development, a prolonged time to reach maturity, and in mature animals, there's loss of weight and also decreased milk production. Now, in terms of prevention, control, and treatment, once the animal becomes malnourished, that means lacking what we call the essential nutrients, for example, carbohydrates and protein, most small farmers are not able to correct this. This is beyond their reach. And so I encourage farmers and even us as we practice agriculture as practitioners to ensure that our animals never reach that stage of malnutrition. Because once malnutrition sets in, it's very difficult to, what we say, correct it. But if the animal becomes malnourished, for example, there are some ways that we could alleviate this malnutrition. So, for example, we can carry out deworming in cattle or in the other animals to make sure that they are getting the nutrients from the food that they are eating. Because we're unable to correct severe malnutrition, students, it therefore means that as farmers too, what we need to do is to sell those animals or slaughter them once they become very weak, because the condition will worsen and the animals will go further down. Also, once the animal becomes malnourished, the animal should not be forced to be productive. For example, that is by putting them to work, because this will only worsen the condition. Good? Let us move on now to look at fats and lipids. Fats and lipids are made up of what we call fatty acids and glycerol. Fats have 2.25 times more energy than carbohydrates and are used to supply energy and also to store energy. Once the animal has surplus fat, or what we say is going to be stored underneath the skin, and surplus energy from carbohydrates is converted to fat. Sources of fat for farm animals may come from cotton meal and linseed meal, or even from fish oil as well, for example, for our dairy cattle. Let's move on now to look at vitamins. Vitamins are organic compounds required in the diet in small quantities for healthy growth and development. And we have placed our vitamins into two groups. One we call the fat-soluble vitamins, such as vitamins A, D, E, and K, and water-soluble vitamins, such as vitamins B and C. Now, students, even though vitamins are required in small quantities, they play a very important role in the health and development and growth of our farm animals. And if these vitamins are not present that we outlined before, the fat-soluble vitamins or the water-soluble vitamins, you're going to see some signs of deficiency. For example, retarded growth in farm animals, poor reproduction, skin ailments, hemorrhage, such as, that means overbleeding. They're going to have diarrhea, night blindness, rough coat, and even muscular problems. So vitamins are very important in the diet of our farm animals. And so we are then able to get vitamins from different sources. The farmer can buy the vitamin from the farm store. You can get supplements. And then also the animals are now able to get vitamins from the pasture grasses, the cereal grains that they consume, and they can also obtain vitamin D from the sunshine. So there are different sources that they are able to garner their vitamins. Let's move on now to look at minerals. Minerals are important too, and they promote healthy growth and development of our farm animals. They are very important because if they are not there, then the animal is also going to see some deficiency. You're going to see some lack. Because minerals, they all have what we call specific roles in the body of farm animals. And when we talk about the minerals, there are 16 essential mineral elements, students, and they are divided into what we call macro and micro elements. Macro meaning that the animals are going to need these minerals in large quantities, and micro elements mean that they're going to need these in what we call small or trace quantities. And so some examples of macro elements, we have nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus, and potassium. And examples of what we call the microelements are like your zinc, your boron, and your copper. So we want to take a look at two of those macronutrients and the specific role that they play in the lives of our farm animals. And we want to look at calcium and phosphorus. When the animal have these minerals in their body, it will not allow them to have strong bones and teeth. And for poultry, they're going to have what we call stronger eggshells. That means they will not break easily. And also for dairy cattle, calcium and phosphorus is going to help to prevent milk fever as well. So what we have looked at so far, students, we have looked at the 6 essential nutrients that farm animals need in order to grow and to do well. We have looked at water. We have looked at carbohydrates. We have looked at proteins. We have looked at fats and oils. We have looked at vitamins. And we have also looked at minerals. And we realize that when these nutrients are lacking, that the animals will show signs of deficiency. They'll not be able to produce as well as they should. And if they are not able to produce as well as they should, it is going to mean that it's going to affect our profit. And once the profit is affected, it means that you and I are going to be having trouble in terms of continuing the practice of agriculture in such a way that we really want to be able to carry it out. Good? Now, we now need to find out some sources of minerals. Where will the farm animals get their sources of minerals? And so they'll be able to get their sources from the crops that they eat, right? They'll also get their sources from cereal grains such as rice and corn, and also from mineral licks. As you can see in the picture right there, where the sheep, they're actually licking that mineral lick in order to get additional minerals if they are not able to get it in the pasture grasses that they are eating. They can also get mineral too from bone meal, fish meal, and blood meal as well. We now want to look at some materials that we use for livestock feed. And when we talk about materials, some of these materials, we get them locally as well as imported. And so we are able to get the materials for the livestock feed from the grasses that they eat, the legumes, the root crops, and the vegetables. We may get the materials too from bagasse and molasses from the processing of sugar cane, from fish meal also from fish, rice bran from rice, wheat middling. We could also get it from the citrus industry, the citrus pulp. We could also get it from coconut meal, from the coconut industry. We could also get it from the brose industry. All of these are different materials that we can get from different industry so that our animals can do well. And don't forget, for example, for pigs, we can give them swills. That means the leftover food materials, the peeling skin, the waste stuff that we don't want, like the cabbage and all of those things, we can put that in and we give it to our pigs as well, and they'll be able to get nutrients from those materials. Now, let us recap by looking at a past paper question. Because as we go through, students, and every time you complete a topic, you need to go now to look to see if you can answer questions and how you'll be able to answer them. Because at the end of the day, we want to prepare you so that you're able to do well, not just to do well, but to do excellent in all of your subjects. Good? So we want to look at this question. Fish provide high-quality protein for human consumption and is a feed supplement for livestock. Explain 2 ways in which fish can be utilized as supplements for livestock feed. So all along we have been talking about fish meal. Let me just go into explain. So when we talk about fish meal, we can use a fish head. We can use all the waste from the fish. So if you go to them, let us say you go to the seaside, all of that can be done when they clean the fish. And also they may also catch some fish too that is not used for human consumption. All of that can be processed, grind up to make what we call a fish cake, and then placed in the feed as a supplement to ensure that the diet or the concentrate that we give to the animals are going to be rich in protein. So that is one way in which we can supplement their diet from fish. Another way is by using fish oil. Some fish are able to produce a lot of oil. We can use that now as a supplement as well. And this is used mainly in the dairy industry because those dairy animals are going to need what we call the extra omega-3. So to answer the question, the 2 supplements may be from the fish cake and also from the fish oil. Good? Let us move on now to look at ration. and the types of ration that we need to feed our farm animals. So when we talk about ration, students, we are referring to the type, quality, and quantity of food that is fed to a particular farm animal or a group of animals. And once you have the ration that you want to feed your animals, the ration should provide the maintenance requirement for the animal as well as the production requirement. Once we start preparing food for animals, we now need to think or consider the following factors. We now need to think that based on the type, the quality or the quantity of food, we now need to think that if we're going to feed these animals, we need to consider the age of the animal, the physical condition of the animal, the stage of growth they have reached, and also the essential food nutrients that the animals need. We have to think about these questions first before we go ahead now to prepare their ration. Because for younger animals, they are going to need more protein in their ration than for older animals. Let us now look at types of ration. We have 3 types of ration. We have the maintenance ration, we have the production ration, and we have a balanced ration. So now we want to look at the maintenance ration. And the maintenance ration is a diet which satisfies the energy and protein needs of the animal. It provides for body repairs and metabolic processes without any gain or loss in its stored energy reserves or body weight. Is the extra food added to the maintenance requirement which is used by the farm animal for productive purposes, such as for meat, milk, eggs, hair, wool, and offspring result also from the production ration. We want to zero in now to look at a balanced ration. Once we talk about the balanced ration, it must consist of all the essential nutrients in amounts needed to satisfy both maintenance and production requirements of the animal. A balanced ration also, students, should supply all the essential food constituents. It must have the correct proportion of energy to protein as well as vitamins and minerals. And the balanced ration too is usually more palatable and satisfies the animal's appetite. So we have to pay attention. We have to make sure that when we feed our animals, we are giving them a balanced ration. Good. There must be adequate amount of maintenance requirement there and production requirement so that our animals will be able to grow and develop and to do well. Because remember, we have a time frame too that we are going to need to get those animals out to slaughter them and to sell them. So when the animal have a balanced diet, they'll be able to reach that at the shortest possible time. Let us now recap by looking at a past paper question. And this time I want to look at a multiple choice question. Right, students? And so as we go through now, I want to be able now to match your answer with my answer. Good? Are you ready? Okay, let us go. Which of the following should give a farmer precise information on the effectiveness of feed given to broilers? Let's look at the different answers we have here. Is it A, stage of maturity of birds, B, commercial ration label, C, conversion ratio, and D, health of the birds? What do you have for your answer, students? All right. So we both have the same answer. All of us, we have the same answer. The answer is B, commercial ration label. Let us now move on to look at appropriate ration for livestock. So when we feed our livestock, we can feed them with forages, we can feed them with concentrates, we can feed them also with fodder. We have different types of appropriate ration for our livestock. And so I want you to understand what we mean by all of these different rations and the sources that we'll be able to get these rations from. So let us take a look now at forages. We get forages for our farm animals from green pasture grasses, legumes, mulberry, and neem. The farm animals, and we're talking basically on what we call animals that are grazing. The farm animals are allowed to either graze or forage, or they could have the forages when you cut them and you're able to feed them in their stalls. Forages also includes thick, fleshy, juicy stems, roots, fruits, and leaves of certain crops, such as sweet potato, cassava, and banana. Further, these are dried stuffs such as hay, straws, and chaff, and they are usually used when forage is unavailable, and that could also include chopped feedstuff, such as corn stalks, elephant grass, and kudzu. And the next type of ration we could give them is silage, and this is pasture grasses and legumes and other crops that are conserved and stored in silos. So let us now move on to look at concentrates. And when we talk about concentrates, these are commercially produced food, and they are normally produced into what we call feed mills, and we could use both local and imported feedstuffs. Commercial concentrates are designed to suit the maintenance and the production needs of different farm animals. And so the concentrate could be mixed, it could be mashed, it could be ground, granular, or pelleted. Or the concentrate could be high in protein, that is for younger animals, or it could be one that is low in protein for older animals. The concentrate could be high in fiber or low in fiber. It could be high in carbohydrate and also very rich in essential vitamins and minerals. Different types of concentrates are out there, students, so that we are able to meet the needs of our animals. Let us now move on now to look at ration for broilers and layers. And I want to pay keen attention because you know that we have that broiler SBA to complete, and we need to be able to complete that at good enough time that the teachers will be able to mark them, and you'll be able to get back your corrections, and then you have to put everything together good. And you remember that we are doing the broiler SBA for both single award and double award students in CSEC Agricultural Science. So when we look at ration for broilers and layers, we have to consider certain questions too. We have to then ask ourselves the question, before we even go into the farm store now to buy that ration. What is the stage of growth of development that you're going to need the ration for? Yes, you want to know the name of the ration that you need to purchase for your animal. And you also have to think about cost, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we make a profit. Good? So the stage of growth of development, you have to then ask yourself the question based on the poultry. Are we going to raise some chicks? Are the adult broilers we need the ration for? Or is the ration for pullet or laying hens? You also need to know the name of the ration for broilers and layers. Starter, grower, finisher, layer, or for egg production. And when we think about cost, you want to make sure that the high protein feeds, the starters, are usually more expensive than low protein feeds, such as the finisher. But you need to know, based on the age of the animal, which feed you need to give that animal. Good? Let us now go in to look at the names of the poultry ration. So we have the starter ration. The starter ration is given to broilers from their day-old chicks until they are 6 weeks old. Good? Pay attention to that, students. The grower ration, on the other hand, are given to layers until they are 15 weeks old. And the laying ration is given to layers when they are 15 weeks old and right up until when we cull them. And the finisher ration is given to broilers from they are 7 to 9 weeks old. But usually, students, for us here in Jamaica or in the Caribbean, we are taking out our broilers at week 5 or week 6. So therefore, we need to know which ration to buy for the broilers that we are raising at our schools. Good? Let us look at this other question. Let us recap and look at this question. Because so far, we have looked at the different nutrients that the animals are going to need. We are now looking at the ration now for broilers and layers. Question. Broilers are slaughtered at 6 weeks old. The most suitable ration for a 5-week-old broiler is it A, millet, B, starter, C, grower, or is it D, finisher? So based on what we have just discussed, students, the answer would have been B, starter, because we are getting out our chickens at 6 weeks old. Good. So now we need to move on now to look at feed conversion ratio. And you must understand, students, how to work the feed conversion ratio, because this is important for you to complete your SBA. And feed conversion ratio, we normally use the acronym FCR. Good? So remember that you have to work out some things in your SBA. You have to work out your dressing percentage. So when you slaughter your animals and you have dressed them, we call that the dress weight, which of course you must know. And then now, because we are feeding the animals from day 1 to 6 weeks old, you then must make a table that you're able now to keep your records of the total feed that you're going to feed your animals. And remember, students, for example, your broilers, when you have them in the brooder, they will not eat a lot in that first week. They'll drink a lot of water. If you put too much feed in there for those young baby chicks in the brooder, they are going to waste the feed. And remember that you have to give them fresh feed every day. So if you pay attention in brooding, and if you don't waste the feed, it means that you're operating in an efficient way. And then that is going to have an impact also on your feed conversion ratio. So feed conversion ratio, students, is the number of units of feed per kilogram an animal uses to produce 1 unit kilogram increase in body weight or 1 unit of product. So if I come to class and I say to you that the chickens have a feed conversion ratio of 2 to 1, I am saying to you that the chickens will be able, they need to consume 2 kilograms of feed in order to put on 1 kilogram of weight. When we know the feed conversion ratio, we are able to do other things. We are then able to what we call work out our budget then, based on the number of chickens that we are going to raise, so that we know how many bags of feed to buy. So when you do your proposed budget, you're then able to compare that with your actual budget in your SBA, so that you know exactly what you're doing. So the feed conversion ratio is very, very important, because you want to know if the chickens that you buy from your farm store, if they are efficient feeders. Because if you're saying that you're raising chickens and at the end of the 6 weeks, you're getting like a feed conversion ratio of 4 to 1, it means that something is wrong. Because you're saying that your chickens are going to need 4 kilograms of food in order to put on 1 kilogram of body weight. And that is not good. And that is why it is important for us as farmers and practitioners to pay attention to the efficiency, or what we call the feed conversion ratio, when we raise our broilers and our animals. So, once we talk about the feed conversion ratio, students, it is indicated how efficiently the animal is going to convert feed into products. This ratio is also associated with economics in terms of the cost of the feed to the farmer. The efficiency of conversion can vary among animals of the same breed and in the same litter. And a young animal converts feed more efficiently than older animals. Good? And so that is why we need to pay close attention to the feed conversion ratio. That is why many farmers don't make any profit when they raise their chickens at home. You can't be raising 50 chickens and you're using 20 bags of feed. Something is wrong with that. And so we need to understand the importance of working out, or knowing how to work out, or how to deal with the FCR, or what we call the feed conversion ratio. So there's a table here that gives us an idea of the different animals and their feed conversion ratio. And so when you raise your broilers at your different schools, you then need to work out your feed conversion ratio to see if you're doing better than what they have here, because it is very important for you to always compare to see if you're right there in the average, or you're doing better if it is low, or you're way above that, because that is very, very important, because it means that you need to go back and look at your management practices in order to ensure that you're having what we call a good feed conversion ratio. So for cattle students, the feed conversion ratio is 4 to 4.5 to 1. That means for cattle, they need 4 or 5 kilograms of food in order to put on 1 kilogram of weight. Good. For pigs, we're talking about 3.5 to 4. They need 3.5 to 4 kilograms of food in order to put on 1 kilogram of body weight. And goats and cattle, they are in the same category, requiring 4.5 to 5 kilograms of food in order to put on 1 kilogram of weight. And rabbits and chickens, we are looking at them because their average is 3 to 3.5 kilograms of food that they need to consume in order to put on 1 kilogram of body weight. So when you raise your chickens now, students, remember, you need to now work out your feed conversion ratio. So I'm now going to move on now to look at how we calculate the feed conversion ratio. Good. Now, when we're going to calculate the feed conversion ratio, you need to know the amount of feed that you're going to feed the animals, and you're also going to need to know your dressed carcass weight at the end of raising your broilers. So the formula states that FCR is the total amount of feed consumed by the animals divided by the total amount of product produced at the end of slaughtering, or we could refer to that as the dressed carcass. Let us look at this example, students. A chicken farmer produces 1,000 kilograms of chicken carcass in 6 weeks. The birds consumed a total of 2,200 kilograms of feed. Calculate the FCR. So, remember the FCR is the total amount of feed consumed over the total amount of product produced, or what we call the dressed carcass or the chicken carcass. So here we have the total amount of feed consumed during that 6 weeks, 2,200 kilograms, divided by the dressed carcass, which is 1,000 kilograms. And so this farmer is seeing a feed conversion ratio of 2.2. This is excellent feed conversion ratio. Yes? Because he's now able to use 2.2 kilograms of feed to give the animals to put on 1 kilogram of weight. So remember, students, keep your records when you're working also that you can calculate your FCR correctly at the end of the 6 weeks. So some students also, they raised some chickens, 100 chickens. At the end of the period, they were able to obtain an FCR of 2.73 to 1. That is still a good feed conversion ratio, because remember, for chickens and rabbits, we are looking at 3 to 3.5 to 1. So this is excellent. It means that the management practices, they are doing very, very well. The importance of FCR, as I wrap up with you now, is to estimate the amount of feed required to feed an animal for its growing cycle. Also, to determine if rearing a certain type of animal will be profitable, because sometimes it's not. Good? So that is all for today's lesson, students. If you have any questions, send them into the Ministry of Education and Television Jamaica social media pages. I'm Janet White Taylor. Up next, Cape Caribbean Studies.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.
we're back with more in Cape Caribbean Studies. We'll be continuing our journey today looking at institutions. I'm Melissa Beckford Simpson. Let's get right into it because we don't have a lot of time today. So as I said, we'll be looking at institutions today. And we want to understand the development of 4 institutions. Hopefully we'll be able to complete all 4 of them. And we want to discuss their impact on Caribbean society and culture. All right, so we want to define institutions. We want to explain the 4 types of institutions. We want to discuss the extent to which the various migrations, the historical process that we already discussed. And we want to talk about the major theories, 2 major theories, the conflict and the functionalist perspective for at least 2 of these institutions. And we want to see how much these institutions have shaped Caribbean life. All right, so what is an institution, first of all? It is a social framework that shapes our lives. It is created by the society that we live in. It is enduring. It continues over time. It shapes people's lives and it determines norms and values and attitudes. And it establishes standard patterns of behavior in terms of the roles of every individual in the society. All right? So in short, institutions help to regulate the society. And what did we define as a society again? We said that a society is a locale of people with a shared common purpose, a defined territorial space, continuity over time, and citizenship within a space. So let's look at the family, the first institution, right? And we want to take it from a historical kind of explanation today because that is important to how the Caribbean family has developed over time. So, of course, when we talk about a historical explanation, we already did this. We can't talk about anything to do with Caribbean studies and the issues of Caribbean life without talking about colonialism, slavery, resistance, indentureship, right? And of course, emancipation. So we can't talk about Caribbean life without all of these things. Let us remind ourselves of the people who we're talking about. We're talking about, first of all, the indigenous people, the Tainos and the Kalinagos, then the Europeans, first the Spanish and then the British and French and so on, then Africans, East Indians and Chinese, East Indians and Chinese after emancipation. All right? We also want to talk about enslavement and indentureship as being very, very important because the majority of Caribbean people are Africans whose ancestors were taken across the Middle Passage here in the Caribbean and forced to work, enslaved. All right? So all of those things shape Caribbean life and Caribbean families. And so we end up with this chart right here, right? So we have the Caribbean family in the center, and we are looking at Europeans, and this is what we get from the Europeans, the nuclear family. We have Indo-Caribbean, which brought to us extended family system and what we also call joint households and a patriarchal kind of system. Afro-Caribbean, matrifocal in its outlook, which means that the female is the center of the household, even if there's a male present, and visiting extended and so on, right? Mixed, nuclear, extended, patriarchal. And of course, we talk about the Chinese and Syrians and so too, who came with an extended patriarchal system. So in the Caribbean, then, in a nutshell, we have a very colorful and diverse kind of family system. All right? So the Caribbean family forms. Let's look at the nuclear family now, in particular. We know the nuclear family. It is the kind of family where you have a mother and a father and a child or children, and they constitute the family. They alone live in the space that is called the home. All right? Now, this form is not necessarily the most popular, though it is widely considered to be the better form. right? And it is Eurocentric in its ideology, because this idea of the nuclear family first came to the Caribbean via the Europeans, right? They were the ones who said that the nuclear family, the mother and the father and the children, is the best kind of family. Do you agree? But while they said that, and they were the enslavers, they did not necessarily accommodate a kind of system where this was possible for the enslaved Africans, because the enslaved Africans did not actually get a chance to develop this kind of family unit. What then did we do? All right? We Africans are used to an extended family unit. Yes, where it's not just the mother and the father and the children, but there's also grandparents and great-grandparents and aunts and uncles who are a part of the family unit, and everybody works together to help in the upbringing of the children. All right? So you do have this idea of the extended family, or the Africans came with their understanding of the extended family, but they were not allowed to reproduce this to any great extent on the plantation. All right? But that's not to say that they did not preserve any form of family life, though they were most times prevented from doing so by the plantation owners. They did develop some form of family life. Again, with the female usually an older female, as the center, as the focal point of the family on the plantation. The male was an asset or a liability, depending on how you looked at it, right? But the woman was always the center of the family unit. Now, we also have other kinds of family types in the Caribbean, and these are actually way more common than the nuclear and the extended unit. The single parent, what we call single parent, and more so female-headed households than male-headed single parent households. We have the visiting union, which is way more popular than it is given credit for. And of course, we have common law unions. Marriages were not always encouraged by the plantation owners, and the Africans had to have the explicit permission of the plantation owner in order to jump the broom, because that was part of their tradition, right? The men and the women were not always living together, and so you did not necessarily have children growing up with this understanding of the male in the family. And of course, the family is matrifocal. All right, so as we said, the slave marriages were sometimes banned. Polygamy was very, very common. And of course, this situation where the slave masters themselves were the fathers of the children on the plantation. Now, you find this to be very common. So in a lot of cases, it wasn't the black man who was the father. In any case, it was the white man. But we should remember that a child took the status of the mother. And so when a child is born, regardless of who fathered it on the plantation, the child would take the status of the mother and therefore would automatically become a slave as well. Unless the father, which may be the plantation owner, took some kind of liking to the child and decided that they wanted to have the child not, necessarily operating this way. And you did have some of that, because you did have white fathers who bequeathed their plantations to their offspring that were from slave women or enslaved women. All right? So we see the social hierarchy of the society. We are reminded of this. And so it is from this that you have the family unit developing. And it is characterized as generally a dysfunctional kind of system, because the fathering of the children, even though we're using these terms, fathering of the children, the fathering of the children was not something by the white man, was not something that the black woman would always welcome. And notice I said always welcome, because sometimes this was welcomed by the black woman. All right. So what are the theoretical perspectives on the Caribbean family? We always want to look at the conflict perspective, right? Put forward primarily by Marx. And we remind ourselves that Marx says of everything that the society is divided into two, the bourgeois at the top and the proletariat at the bottom. The bourgeois own the means of production. And Marx sees everything through the lens of economics, right? And capital and production. And he sees that the family unit is also used to reinforce the same kind of idea, right? About production, especially when you talk about the family unit for the proletariat who are at the bottom of the society, just used to reinforce the same inequalities in the society. All right? And so Marx talks about the working class as the proletariat and how it is that they reproduce. They reproduce as merely a part of a chain, as merely people who were going to now produce again for the bourgeois. And so that is the function of the family as Marx looks at it. All right, so what do we say of the functionalist? The functionalist says that the family is functional. It's necessary. It's important for the smooth running of the society so that society is not disordered and chaotic and anarchic, you know. It is so important to have the family structure to keep the society well ordered. And so, of course, we know that the functionalist, this is the general idea. Now, we have some trends in Caribbean families, you know, we have a lot of things that go on when we talk about Caribbean families, and the idea of the Caribbean family is way more complicated than we are able to talk about right here. Because we could explore, for example, the myth of the nuclear family, right, in the Caribbean. A Eurocentric ideal and something brought forward to the Caribbean when it's not necessarily something that we subscribe to. And so family is seen as dysfunctional in the Caribbean because there are so many visiting unions and common law relationships and sibling families, right? Which is squarely where we are. Because we have this phenomena of migration in the Caribbean. A lot of parents migrate. Sometimes it's both parents, sometimes it's one parent, and they go to seek a better life for their children. And so you have this idea of the barrel children. But more than that, you have a lot of Jamaican children who are actually grown by their grandparents. Yes, very successful people too, grown by their grandparents. And you also have a lot of sibling families, an older brother or sister in charge of the younger ones. That's very, very common as well. Another issue that we have, social mobility and education in the Caribbean, and how this affects the family. You find that amongst the more educated in the society, we lean towards the nuclear, the Eurocentric ideal of the family. And so you do not have this issue of what is thought of to be dysfunctional, where the Caribbean woman is all about the place and she has several different partners, you know, and these partners are all or none at all contributing to the home that she is developing. And you have several children without any father and so on. So you have a change and, you know, a kind of trend in the Caribbean where the family forms are looking and leaning towards being more and more nuclear. But we still have those other kinds of families present, right? We talk about poverty and transactional sex, and this leading to more children, right? And then, of course, issues with the family structure, sex tourism, HIV and AIDS, all of these things affect the family form in the Caribbean. And students, in order to get a good sense, a good understanding of what we're talking about, you will need to do some reading on your own. The truth is that today we can only scratch the surface of these institutions because there are so many things to talk about. We could talk about, for example, again, the male marginalization thesis, where it is said that there are so many more women. And we can go into that as we go into education as an institution. So many more women are accessing higher education, tertiary education, right? And that there is a thrust, or there was a thrust coming some out of the 1940s and so on, for having more women educated, establishing more schools for girls and so on. But this has led to the marginalization of the male, right? The male is supposed to go work. You know, he is a man. He must go work and carrying money for the family. Oh, you mean you want to go to school, and if you spend more money on you, if you go to school, but you go to school. You know, these are the kinds of ideas, and you still find that a number of Jamaican parents and Caribbean parents still think about it this way and still feel this way. And so we have an issue when we talk about education as an institution. All right? But there are different phases of education in the Caribbean, and we want to look at these phases, what we call pre-colonial education. You'll see these terminology, and you must reproduce some of this terminology when you are writing. What do we mean by pre-colonial? We're talking about before the era of colonialism by the Spanish and the French and the British. Now, education is not always formal, you know, in the way that we see it in a school, primary, secondary, you know, early childhood, tertiary, and so on. It's not always that way. Education also refers to the passing on of accepted values and norms. And education, in fact, begins in the home, with the family, even now. But we can look at the indigenous people and what their education system was like. In earlier lessons, we talked about the Kalinago and their induction, their rites of passage of the Kalinago male, the young male. From he's very young, he's taken from his mother. He has to go with the men, right? And then he learns to be tough. He learns he has to pass a series of tests in order to become a man, to become male. And then the female is also cultured by the women to do the same kinds of things. I know a lot of you out there, you would have at some point or the other read The Young Warriors. And you would have seen Johnny and his friends there, you know, and this is related to the Maroons and their rites of passage that the young men had to go through. That is also education. That is also education. So the indigenous peoples had an education system. It may not be how we consider it, and it may not be considered to be formal education, but it was in fact an education system. And it was largely connected with gender roles, as we said, what females are to do, what males are to do in this society. And so it is taught. All right, so we have pre-emancipation. Was there any such thing as education before emancipation? Was there any such thing? We're talking about the period of colonialism, all right? And this is also called colonial education. But we divide it into two because colonial goes all the way up to 1962. When we became independent, well, most Caribbean countries or a number of Caribbean countries became independent beginning at 1962. All right? So we are talking about all of this period, but we have cut it into two. The pre-emancipation period, the period of working on the plantations. Was there any education whatsoever, do you think? Was there any education? Yes, there was some amount of education, but not necessarily formal education for the majority, which would be the free blacks. There was formal education for whites, right? Though it was not so very popular within the West Indies. So the young men would probably be flown back to England, to Britain, to be educated, and the young women would be sent to a finishing school and so on. So there was some formal education for the whites. Though there were no formal education systems developed for the blacks had their own education system because there was a passing on of traditions, of rights, you know, of beliefs and skills. So, for example, if you had one, you know, what they would call Mayal woman or Mayal man, right? And there's a kind of misconception about what the Mayal was about. The Mayal is different from Obia, you know. The Mayal person was usually the kind of individual who operated as a doctor, right? A bush medicine person. And this individual would know the right kind of bush for whatever it was that needed to be done. You ever hear the folk song, Helena ni Mumago Agrong? And Helena start to ball for your belly. Go home, Helena, go boil seriously for your belly. Anybody know exactly what Helena was trying to do? Because the mother come home and see the bun pan the fire. And she asked the girl, what is your boil for your belly? A pie is your boil for your belly? So you did have these skills being passed on. So from early, you would have this male individual having an apprentice and the skill would be passed on, right? And that is just one example. Cooking, ways of preparing food, and all of these things were passed on from one generation to another, right? We also had the missionaries. Let's not bypass them because the missionaries, the non-conformist missionaries, we're talking about the Methodists and the Baptists and so on, they were responsible, Quakers, they were responsible for teaching a number of enslaved how to read. They did. They are non-conformists because they did not adapt to the church, to the state of the church or to the church of the state, right? So you would have Roman Catholicism or Anglicanism, and they were different. And so they would also help to teach some of the enslaved how to read. Of course, this was banned by the planters, and planters had all kinds of issues with them learning how to read. All right? So you did have this passing on, and to some extent, some of the enslaved learned how to read. All right? But post-emancipation said that there was, in fact, some attempt. And we're talking post-emancipation, we mean after 1838. We have already done the historical process, so you know what I'm talking about. The Negro Education Grant after emancipation was an attempt by the British government to allow these free blacks to learn a little bit of the elements, the 3 R's, the reading, writing, arithmetic, yes, and education. So it established primary schools, elementary schools, not necessarily secondary education or tertiary education, unheard of at this time. And so the establishment of a number of these elementary schools meant that a number of brown children could go at first, and then eventually some blacker ones could go, And so you had this kind of instruction. But the missionaries also continued to assist with the process of education. Some of them were the ones who established schools. And so you still have today, majority of the schools in Jamaica are actually church schools because most of the schools were established by these non-conformist churches, right? And then you have eventually some kind of fee paying in the secondary system, eventually. And even when this was established, so you had a few schools like the Woolmers and the Monroe and so on, and in other parts of the Caribbean too, some schools were established. But not everybody could go there, And so you had the common entrance, and the children, especially the boys who would pass the test, would be able to go on to secondary education, but it was still largely not in the hands of the majority of the people in the Caribbean. And so when the 1930s came about, and you had these riots, remember those riots we talked about in the 1930s? These were some of the issues. Apart from the wages and the working conditions, education was one of the major issues that they had a problem with. And when the Moyne Commission that we spoke about gave its report, it did say that there needed to be the establishment of schools. There needed to be education in a much wider way for the free people who lived in the Caribbean. All right, so post-independence now, we had the establishment of a number of schools, primary, secondary, and then tertiary institutions such as the UWI, the Jamaica University College, very, very important because, it became the first premier institution to actually begin to train formally. And at that time, it was mainly males that were being trained to become educators. Right? And then, of course, we had the University of the West Indies. But there were some Caribbean intellectuals, the early Caribbean intellectuals, like the Eric Williams of Trinidad, who were actually bright, so to speak. You know, they were considered to be bright, though they were black, and the Rex Netterford and so on. And they were considered to be bright, and so they were given the opportunity to go to Britain to learn, and they came back as Caribbean intellectuals, beginning in that same 1930s period and coming further down into the independence period and so on. But the education was gendered, still gendered. We spoke about gendered education when we talked about the indigenous people, so it is not something new. But gendered in the sense that, one, there were these girls' schools, boys' schools, yes? And the education, what was taught to boys, the curriculum, what was taught to boys, the woodwork and so on and so forth. And the girls, there were certain subjects that the girls ought to do that the boys should not do, and that kind of thing. And we still have some of these things continuing today in some of these schools, the gendered education. All right, so the historical trajectory of education in the Caribbean tells us that education favors the middle class from ever since. From the Negro Education Grant began to establish primary schools, elementary schools. It rewards linguistic competence, which means that how well you are able to speak the English language. So if you chat too much patois and your talk not sound good, it sound bad, and Louise Bennett would tell us, it's a good word. There's no bad word. It's a good word. But if that is the case, then of course, that was used to judge how educated you are. Access. Who could access? Could the rural people access? Deep rural? Urban, yet ghetto? Could they access inner city communities? Who could access education? All of these things are very important in our understanding. The role of the missionaries, and of course, gender is very, very important to our understanding of education. Let us move on quickly now to religion. And as I tell you, students, we will not be able to cover the gamut of things that we need to talk about as we talk about institutions. Religion. Now, here is another one that is, very, very controversial. We talk about religion. The main religion would be Christianity in the Caribbean. And it has its roots in the coming of the Europeans, of course. Christianity was introduced as the religion. The religion of the indigenous peoples was said to be barbaric, and they had to get rid of it. They had to civilize and humanize and Christianize these people. All right? So Christianity became the standard religion, Roman Catholicism as well as Anglicanism, because eventually the Reformation would have taken place. And so you had a splintering off, and then a number of other religions, Quakers, Baptists, Methodists, Episcopalians, and so on. But we do have other kinds of religions in the Caribbean, because the planters systematically tried to erase the African religion, but it never happened. It never happened at all. So you had distinctly African religions, such as the Voodoo and the Orisha and Obia that still continue in the Caribbean. And then you had the syncretized religions. That is where the elements of Christianity are infused into the African style of worship. And I want to show you just a very short clip of Kumina, a Kumina kind of celebration. It includes a number of African type things, the spiritism and so on. The Shango in Trinidad, revivalism. All of these are what we call syncretic religions because they are mixed with Christianity and African elements. So let us look at this clip here and see if we can pick up some aspects. All right. So do you notice there the drum, right? And do you notice there the lighting that's going on and the singing? And, you know, the shakers and so on, very, very important to Kumina. If you ever get the chance to see a full Kumina or a full revival ceremony, I'm telling you, you'll be thoroughly, thoroughly entertained. All right? And then you have the indigenous religion, Rastafari, or indigenous religion in the Caribbean. Started about the 1930s with one Leonard Howell and then continued. But it didn't, now Rastafari has developed a kind of pride of place, you know, but before now it wasn't so. And so Rastafari continues to walk in its own way in the Caribbean as a distinct kind of religion, a kind of protest religion. All right, so here we have scenes of Kumina and revival. Notice the symbolism there in the revival pic. And we also have scenes of Orisha here from Trinidad, Orisha ceremony, and also Rastafari right there. All right? And of course, we cannot leave out those religions that were brought by the indentured workers after emancipation, right? So we have Islam and we have Hinduism. And even though in Jamaica, these are not necessarily strong, they are strong in other Caribbean countries like Guyana and Trinidad and so on. So they are a part of the whole mix of religion in the Caribbean. And therefore, what we can say is that religion is very, very diverse and full and rich in the Caribbean. All right? What do our theorists have to say about religion? Yes? The functionalist says religion is important, right? It helps in identity. It helps to keep the status quo. It helps to keep the function in the society and the order and so on. But Marx says that religion is the opiate of the people. It's a drug, and it only serves to reinforce all of the inequalities that exist in the society, and that in the religions themselves, there's an hierarchical structure that is maintained by religion, and so religion is a part of the problem, right? So Marx says that about all of these things. So we now understand the theoretical perspective. Let us just briefly, very briefly, look at the justice system. And this one you will definitely need to do your own reading because we won't be able to cover all of what needs to be covered. We're talking about the justice system. We're talking about a legal and political system that is put in place to ensure order and chaos and to prevent chaos in the society. So we're talking about the police, we're talking about the court system, we are talking about the penal system as a part of the justice system, all right? And we're talking about laws or supreme law, the constitution that determines how we operate in the society and the establishment of the basis of our society. We're talking about the human rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights that we signed on to from 1948. All of these come under what we talk about as the justice system. We can only scratch the surface today, students. So we talk about the court system. Here are some examples of some of the courts: the Petty Sessions Court, Resident Magistrates Court, High Court, and so on. And the Privy Council, which is based in Britain, in Europe, but we are moving or seeking to move into using the Caribbean Court of Justice, which was established in 2001 to serve as the final court of appeal. However, there are so many issues still with the Caribbean Court of Justice, because even though we have established it and everything, it has two jurisdictions. The domestic jurisdiction, which all the Caribbean countries who are part of CARICOM are a part of it, meaning it settles disputes between countries, right? Issues of trade and so on, settles those disputes. But the aim of the Caribbean Court of Justice is the appellate jurisdiction, which is where it now becomes our final court of appeal on criminal matters instead of going to the Privy Council. But in order for that to be done, a number of Caribbean countries need to change aspects of their constitution, and we have not yet done so. And so even though we all contribute to it, many of the Caribbean countries, most of the Caribbean countries are in fact not using the Privy Council. All right? So there are so many things that you need to talk about, that you need to discuss, that you need to read, students, because we are not able to talk about everything that the justice system has to do with. So we want you to go and read, look at the questions. And that is all we have time for today. So we have been discussing institutions in Cape Caribbean Studies. We have looked at 4 institutions: the family, education, religion, and the justice system. You can catch a repeat of all of today's lessons on JNN just for today, starting at 2 p.m. Highlights of the week's programs are also on Saturday between 1 and 4 p.m. and on video on demand on One Spot Media. We also have 2 channels to help with additional lessons devoted to students of all ages on One Spot Media: School Time and School Time Maths. So check them out. Remember to keep safe, wash your hands regularly, sanitize, and wear your mask. Until next time, I'm Melissa Beckford saying, ciao for now.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.